The night was dark, and a young pregnant woman was walking through Hammersmith. She approached the churchyard when she saw something strange. A figure rose up from between the tombstones, tall and dressed in a white shroud. A ghost. The woman screamed and attempted to run, but the ghost was quicker. It grabbed her, pressing her tightly in its arms. The woman fainted and the figure vanished. Hours later, she was discovered by some neighbours who carried her home. There, she died 2 days later, seemingly out of fright. Hello, I'm Nemo, and welcome to the very first episode of the first season of Certainly Strange, a podcast about the unexplainable. Now, for us it might seem silly to be so afraid of what seems to just be a person dressed in a white sheet, but the young woman was right to be afraid. You see, where we might think of just a silly Halloween costume, someone dressed in a white sheet had a very different meaning for those living in the 1800s. For a very long time in Western European cultures, the bodies of the dead were buried wrapped in a white cloth, a burial shroud. The rich, of course, could afford a coffin, but the poor were buried only in a shroud. And then there came sightings of apparitions, figures dressed only in a white shroud. The dead had returned from the grave to haunt the living. Ghosts. And the most famous and most curious case of a ghostly apparition is the mystery and murder of the Hammersmith ghost. It was first spotted in November 1803. Many of the Hammersmith residents thought that the ghost was the restless soul of a man who had recently committed suicide. The ghost is most often described as tall, wearing a white shroud, but some also claim that he had horns and eyes made out of glass. In most cases where people see a ghost, the ghost is harmless, only an after-image of a person, like a shadow or a fading photograph, but not this ghost. No, the Hammersmith ghost was violent, and he was out for blood. The pregnant lady was not the only one the ghost, although indirectly, killed. One evening, an elderly woman was knocked to the ground by the white apparition, and later died out of pure fright, just like the pregnant lady had done. On another occasion, the ghost jumped out in front of a travelling coach, which frightened the driver so much that he ran off into the night, leaving his horses and passengers behind. One resident, Thomas Groom, was attacked by the frightening Hammersmith ghost.
I was going through the churchyard between 8 and 9 o'clock with my jacket under my arm and my hands in my pockets, when some person came from behind a tombstone, creeping up behind me, and called me fast by the throat with both hands and held me fast. My fellow servant, who was going on before, hearing me scuffle, asked what was the matter. Then, whatever it was, gave me a twist around, and as I turned, I saw nothing. I gave a bit of a push out with my fist and felt something soft, like a great coat.
On December 29th, William Gertler, a night watchman, saw the ghost near Beaver Lane and ran after him. But then, the most curious thing happened. The frightening apparition threw off its white shroud. The frightening Hammersmith ghost seemed to be nothing more than a man. And it was something some residents of Hammersmith had already suspected. During this time, it was actually popular amongst thieves and criminals to dress up in white shrouds to impersonate ghosts, so that they could rob their frightened victims. The neighbourhood remained terrified, however. Local people were still paranoid, and local businesses were worried that no one would pass through Hammersmith again to make deliveries because of the reports of this deadly ghost. Ghost or not, something had to be done. They had had enough. A group of men gathered in the Black Lion, the local pub and meeting point of the neighbourhood. London did not have an organised police force at the time, and so they decided to take the law into their own hands. It was time to hunt a ghost. Over their pints, the local men whispered of that which haunted their beloved neighbourhood. Most had seen him. It, the ghost. That white-shrouded figure who had killed 2 women already. And who knows what more he could do? Something had to be done, and quick. At one of the tables, a young man was leaning over his ale. Francis Smith believed in ghosts. Something had to be done about the ghosts indeed, and he was the one who would catch him. He knew it. The following night, at 11 o'clock, there he stood, with his gun in his hand. It was a monstrous thing, the gun. The flintlock with its long muzzle crammed with ball and nails, backed with a mighty charge of powder. If there was one gun that could kill a ghost, this was it. It was a dark night. The moon was cold and gave little light, but it was plenty of light to spot a white spectre, Francis was sure. He walked through the abandoned streets of Hammersmith. Everything was black. And then, suddenly, there it was, tall and white. A ghost stood before him. Francis cried out,
Damn you! Who are you and what are you? Damn you, I will shoot you!
and then he shot. The spectre fell to the ground. It was the 4th of January, 1804, and Thomas Millwood was visiting his sister, Anne. He had just come off from work. He was a bricklayer by profession, and he wore a uniform that was all white. There had already been several misguided attacks on white-smocked workmen mistaken for the ghost, and Millwood had been mistaken for the terrible Hammersmith ghost himself several times. Anne begged Millwood to dress differently, or at least cover up his white clothes, in fear that he could be hurt by someone thinking that he was a true Hammersmith ghost. But he refused. He said farewell to his sister and stepped outside the house to go home. And then Anne heard a gunshot. The neighbours who heard the gunshot all came running outside to see what had happened. They surrounded the body, hoping to help, but the man was already dead. The shaking Francis Smith had shot Millwood in his lower jaw. John Locke and George Stowe, 2 neighbours, approached Francis Smith, who appeared very much agitated. Seeing that he had shot and killed Millwood, Locke and Stowe advised Francis to go home. Millwood's corpse was carried to an inn, where a surgeon, Mr. Flower, examined the body and pronounced him dead as the result of a gunshot wound on the left side of the lower jaw. Francis Smith was arrested for murder, but his trial would take an odd turn, as the ghost identified himself. He was the Hammersmith ghost, he claimed. A local shoemaker named John Graham told the court that he had dressed up as a ghost to scare his apprentice who had terrified Graham's children with ghost stories at night. But that had been only once. Graham did not know anything about the other sightings. It was speculated several people had joined in on his hoax to terrify their neighbours for fun, but none other than Graham ever came forward. Eventually, Francis Smith was sentenced to 1 year of hard labour, and the ghost seemed to have disappeared, at least for nearly 2 decades. In 1825, there it was again, standing amongst the tombstones. Somehow of a legend of a periodic return took hold. The ghost was predicted to appear again on August 3rd, 1955. That night, on 9:30 p.m, about 100 people gathered at St. Paul's churchyard, all in hope of seeing the famous Hammersmith ghost for themselves. By midnight, most people had already gone home, and only 17 remained. At midnight, they saw it. At least they saw something. Something in white wafted out of the northwest doors of the church, which were locked, and drifted to a lone tomb. The ghost was described as tall and covered in a white shroud, hovering above the ground without legs. It floated there, above the tomb, for about 20 seconds, and then it vanished, never to be seen again. Man or apparition, dead or alive, the Hammersmith ghost is certainly strange. So that was the mystery and murder of the Hammersmith ghost. Now, I don't know if any of you believe in ghosts. I personally am a bit of a skeptic. I do believe that there can be like an echo of a person living in a space. If, for example, a very violent murder took place, you can just feel the echo of that violence linger in the air. That is how I believe in ghosts. But the way that the Hammersmith ghost is described, I don't really believe it. I certainly think that the Hammersmith ghost wasn't real. I mean, John Graham already came forward. Like he was this one saying like it was a joke. It was a way to scare my apprentice because he scared my children. It was just like me getting back to him sort of karma. He admitted it was a hoax, and the fact that it just continued just shows like it was already a thing for people in that time to dress up as a ghost to scare someone or to rob someone, because the criminals already were using that tactic to scare people into giving them their money. So I don't really, I don't think that there's any other way of it being a hoax. I don't think that this is a real ghost that actually existed. And also, like the last part I talked about, there was some sort of legend of a periodic return and that a ghost appeared on August 3rd, 1955. That could also very much be a joke or a hoax. Just be like, oh, people are believing it, so we were going to give them a little show. But also the news article. So I found that story on a blog post who referred to a news article who tells about like, oh, there were 17 people who saw the ghost, and I couldn't find that news article anywhere. I've definitely searched. I couldn't find it. I believe I also contacted the blog being like, hey, where are the sources? They didn't come back to that. So I actually think that was a bit of a I am not even certain that ever actually happened. And also a last thing that a lot of people talk about regarding this case, like it was a very famous law case because Francis Smith thought that he was murdering a ghost and accidentally murdering a real person, and just like that discussion of like, is he to blame, like it was an accident, but also like why would you try to shoot a ghost if you really did believe it was a ghost? But the fact that he only got 1 year of hard labor shows that people forgave him for it. Apparently he was very shook about it. He definitely didn't do it on purpose, but it's also just ridiculous to think like that man really believed that he could shoot a ghost. And I don't I just think that this is a very interesting case, not only because of the question of like, ooh, was it real, which I really do not believe it was, but also the question of, is Francis Smith to blame for the murder of Thomas Millwood? I'd love to hear your opinions about it. You can always contact me or message me on social media. Both the website and the social media are Dr. Nemo's Cabinet of Curiosities. And thank you for listening to this very first episode of Certainly Strange, a podcast about the unexplainable. Everything about the podcast and my other projects can be found on the website, Dr. Nemo's Cabinet of Curiosities. That is Dr. Nemo's Cabinet of Curiosities.com. There you can also find a transcript of the episode if you want to read it, and also the sources I used in my research. And once again, thanks for listening.